There we go. Yes, so we are recording.
Okay. So at the heart of many issues in animal ethics lies a question about what exactly is the difference between a human and a non-human animal. Do humans and non-human animals share similar biology, similar emotions, similar thought processes? Or are we fundamentally different in important ways, whether that's biologically, mentally, spiritually? Not surprisingly, Buddhism has opinions on this question. Somewhat more surprisingly, at least surprising to me, the tradition's stance on the human-animal divide is fairly clear and consistent in Buddhist literature. Speaking broadly, Buddhism has traditionally seen humans and animals as theoretically sort of the same type of being, but also as profoundly different on practical levels. And most importantly, the tradition has generally seen the human mind as far superior to animal minds. And it's that mental superiority that makes humans superior to animals on many levels. And yet research has demonstrated that many animals are, in fact, actually quite intelligent, with mental and emotional lives that are not that different from our own. So my argument tonight is that this research into animal cognition should persuade the Buddhist tradition to reevaluate its position on the difference between humans and animals. And that if we do so, the tradition's own logic demands the more calculations surrounding animals, their wants and needs and suffering more seriously. This in turn should change how we treat animals in real life situations. So before I get into most of that stuff, however, I want to start by asking a question, just simply, who cares, right? Who cares about how Buddhism sees the difference between humans and animals, Buddhism or anyone else for that matter? Why should we bother thinking about what, any tradition thinks about the difference between humans and animals? In order to make sense of this, I want to invoke the concept of moral standing or moral status. Moral standing is simply a way of thinking about how much we need to consider the impact of our actions on other beings or objects. To give a somewhat trite example, which you can see in the slide, we all think that it is bad to kick other humans for no apparent reason. But very few of us have moral qualms with kicking a rock. The human in this example has a lot of moral standing, the rock does not. When it comes to animals, how much moral standing they have in a given community is often based on how that community understands the divide between humans and animals. So pretty much everyone agrees that humans have a lot of moral standing just because they're human. This is why we all agree that it's bad to hurt other humans. But there's a lot more variation when it comes to how much moral standing a community will give animals. Some grant animals a lot of moral standing, others almost none. And often the degree of moral standing an animal gets is correlated with how different a person or a community thinks they are when compared to a person. If a community thinks of animals as closely akin to humans, they are much more likely to grant them significant moral standing than if they view animals and humans as wholly different. This can be illustrated by looking at everybody's favorite punching bag, the philosopher Descartes. Descartes argued that humans had rational souls and that animals did not, full stop. This meant that while he believed that humans could think, reason, and feel, animals could do none of those things. For Descartes, this was a fundamental, unbridgeable divide between all humans and all animals, and it meant that animals had no moral standing. One of my favorite quotes about this, he says, "It seems reasonable, since art copies nature and men can make various automata, machines, which move without thought, that nature should produce its own automata, much more splendid than the artificial ones. These natural automata are the animals." In practice, this meant that Descartes was perfectly fine with practices such as vivisection, in which dogs and other animals were dissected while still alive, with humans standing over them, laughing about their cries. If we try to visualize this on our spectrum, Descartes and his fellows would put animals at the far end with essentially no moral standing. So to sum up, how we understand the distinction between humans and animals matters because it influences how much moral standing we give to animals. This in turn governs how well or how badly we treat them. Now, to be fair, this is not the entirety of the picture. How much moral standing we give animals depends on more than just this one factor. But if we look at this question both philosophically and historically, the question of the human-animal divide tracks quite closely with the moral standing given to animals. This brings us to the question at the heart of this talk. How has Buddhism understood the difference between humans and animals? As I mentioned earlier, the tradition has been surprisingly consistent in articulating a moderate position on this question. On the one hand, Buddhism famously denies that anyone, human, animal, or other, has an inherent unchanging self-identity. Instead, the tradition asserts that all beings with any level of mental activity are fundamentally similar, united under the term sentient being. The rigid categorical distinction that Buddhism proposes, then, is not between humans and animals, but between sentient beings of any variety and insentient objects, such as rocks and, somewhat more controversially, plants. An easy way to visualize this is to consider the Baba Chakra, a cosmological diagram often referred to in English as the Wheel of Life. As most everyone here is no doubt aware, the cosmology reflected in the Baba Chakra divides the world into 6, sometimes 5, different realms, that of gods, demigods, humans, animals, ghosts, and hell beings. Importantly, no one is bound forever to a particular form. When a ghost dies, their consciousness will be reborn. The subsequent life could be as a ghost again, but it could also be a god, human, or any other form of sentient life, depending on the individual's karma. This cosmology suggests that humans and animals are fundamentally the same kind of creature. Depending on the karma a particular being has, they could be born as an animal or as a human in any given life. The difference between humans and animals, therefore, is not inherent, categorical, or unchanging. Instead, it is merely adventitious, reflecting the karma of that particular moment rather than a core identity. This represents a firm departure from thinkers like Descartes. Where Descartes understood the divide between humans and animals to be rigid and eternal, Buddhism recognizes a fundamental kinship as sentient beings. And it's worth noting that this has practical ramifications for the treatment of animals. I'm not aware of any major Buddhist thinker who has accepted the treatment of animals that Descartes accepted seemingly without concern. If we go back to our continuum, Buddhism grants animals notably more moral standing than Descartes and those who followed him. But this fairly positive vision of Buddhist perspective on animals is complicated by the fact that the tradition also consistently asserts that birth as a human is far superior to birth as an animal. Human life is regularly presented as one of the higher births, in the same category as birth as a god, and animal birth, on the other hand, is like birth in hell, an unfortunate destiny, a phrase which Rego Onuma takes as the title of her excellent book on animals in Indian Buddhism. Buddhist perspectives on human superiority over animals largely rest on assumptions about our relative intelligence. Humans are presented as highly intelligent and rational. Animals, on the other hand, are kind of dumb. They may be sentient, but it is a low-level sentience that precludes rational engagement with the world. Importantly, the question is not simply one of abstract intelligence, but the ability to use that intelligence to seize control of one's destiny. Humans, we are repeatedly told, have the ability to make choices about what we do. We can understand the difference between right and wrong, and we can choose the path we take. Animals, we are also told, are unable to do this. Instead, they are driven by blind instinct, unable to make more than the most basic choices about how they act. One implication of this view is that only humans are able to make religious progress. Progressing towards nirvana requires an understanding of suffering, an awareness that relief from suffering is possible, and the wherewithal to implement the type of practices that result in the attainment of religious goals. Animals are said to lack all of these abilities, so they cannot perform religious practices and cannot progress towards soteriological goals. As the 20th century Tibetan Lama Kangyo Rinpoche Longchen Yeshe Dorje puts it, being without intelligence, animals cannot recite even a single mani. It is this assumed inability to practice religion that truly makes animal life inferior to human life. Samsara, after all, is characterized by the ongoing repetition of one life after another in an endless chain of birth and death. The only way out of this vicious cycle, Buddhism claims, is through religious practice. So the ability to engage in such practices is very rare, as most potential births, including those in the animal realm, simply lack the ability to either recognize the problems of samsara or to just do anything about it. It is this rare ability to actually intervene in the eons-long cycle of samsara that makes a human birth precious. So, again, in summary, while humans and non-human animals are both sentient beings, non-human animals are said to be significantly stupider and therefore are given lower status than humans. If we put up our continuum again, it might look something like this. Even though Buddhism does claim that humans and animals are fundamentally the same type of being, which grants them some level of moral standing, that position is counteracted by the assumptions that humans are significantly more intelligent than animals. The end result is that the moral standing of animals in Buddhism is not as bleak as in some traditions, but it is still not great. And this lower moral standing has practical ramifications. While it is bad to kill an animal, it is much worse to kill a human. Killing an animal, Buddhist texts make clear, causes it to suffer and is therefore a karmically negative act. But doing the same to a human not only causes that person to suffer, it also removes the possibility that that person could use the rest of their life to religion. For this and other reasons, Buddhist texts generally claim that killing a human is far worse than killing an animal. Given this privileging of the human over the animal, it's no surprise that animals are not treated as well as humans. Okay, at this point I've argued, possibly for too long, that Buddhism has traditionally created a robust division between humans and animals. Different Buddhist communities have different takes on this, of course, but overall, this pattern holds throughout much of the Buddhist world, kind of, to my mind, again, surprisingly so. The strength of this division, however, rests on the assumption that humans have significantly higher mental capacities than non-human animals. What I want to do today is reevaluate that core assumption. Scientists working in a variety of fields have discovered that some species of animals are actually highly intelligent, far more so than we would have assumed not too long ago. Gorillas are capable of learning human sign language. Chimpanzees create and use tools. Octopi, and honestly, I'm sorry, but I think we can all agree this is just kind of awesome. Open latches, escape from their tanks, crawl across the floor, and squeeze themselves through drain pipes, all in order to escape captivity. Octopi, it seems, can evaluate the circumstances of their captivity and plan detailed, kind of epic jailbreaks. Finally, we now know that prairie dogs speak in complete sentences with subject, object, and verb. And what's more, and this is the awesome part, we can speak back. By changing the order of recorded prairie dog chirps and playing them through speakers, scientists have been able to have legitimate conversations with prairie dogs, exchanging meaningful information. Same, I learned just the other day, for whales, and I would add, presumably, many other species. As these examples illustrate, research into the non-human animal intelligence now routinely shows that animals are capable of thought on a level that we once assumed was limited to humans. Further, non-human animal intelligence is not limited to speech or tool use or planning. Animals have also been shown to have highly complex social and emotional lives. Numerous species have been shown to form complex family and cultural units, for instance, with parents recognizing and caring for their own children, while sometimes remaining open to adopting orphans. Elephants are perhaps the best known example of this, but similar patterns are seen in many other species as well, including farmed animals. On this point, I'm going to digress a little bit and tell you a story about a rancher that I hung out with for a while in Texas, who told me about his experience when he changed ranching practices and allowed cows of various ages to intermingle. Usually, the cattle on his family ranch, or previously I should say, had been sequestered by age, as is apparently typical ranching practice. So you have all the 1-year-old cows in the same sort of space as the 1-year-old cows, and then the older cows in a different area. At some point, he decided to shift to mob herding, in which all of the animals are allowed to mingle freely. Anyway, when he shifted to mob herding, the rancher told me, his cattle immediately identified and mingled with their biological families, with mothers easily identifying children that they had not seen in years. This is actually something that you can see for yourself. And I don't know what the highway patrol in your various states or countries will think about this, but I recommend just stopping on the side of the road next time you're driving around and you see a herd of cows, and walk up to the fence and see what happens. And just the other day, my daughter and I stopped at the side of the road to do this and to sort of chat with a herd of cows that lives near us. And as we stood next to the fence, 2 curious sort of yearling steers came over to us. And as they got closer, though, this older female kind of trotted right up and placed herself between them and us, seemingly trying to sort of create this separation between the curious youngsters and the suspicious, probably scary humans. It was kind of awesome to watch this interplay go on. I don't know if this was a family dynamic or just a friendship or a general herd thing. But it's interesting to go and just sort of stop and watch and see what you see. Okay, beyond emotional attachments to living relatives, some animal species have also been shown to mourn their dead. Scientists have observed, for instance, that crows and ravens congregate around their dead in ways that suggest funerals. And you may recall the story from 2018 about an orca mother who carried the body of her calf for 17 days following its death. Reading this story, it was impossible for me not to think of the Buddha's interaction with the distraught mother, Kiso Gotami, and the universality of grief. But perhaps most intriguing for our discussion here is the suggestion that some animals may practice something that could loosely be called religion. Jane Goodall has observed that when particular communities of chimpanzees see a waterfall, they perform an unusual dance. By unusual, what she means is they display behaviors that they otherwise don't usually do, such as touching water, getting their feet wet, which apparently is not something that chimpanzees like, but they do this at this, when they encounter this waterfall. And this waterfall dance, Goodall claims, is best understood as a form of religious practice, whose specific aims and goals we obviously don't know, but which, in her observation, appears to represent an affective response to being in the presence of this waterfall. Other researchers have observed similar behavior in chimpanzees on the presence of wildfire as well. So this suggestion of animal religion opens up all sorts of possibilities in our understanding of animal lives, and also in our understanding of what the heck we mean with the word religion, but that's a whole other paper. So all of this points to an emerging awareness that non-human animals have intellectual and emotional lives far more complex than most humans have previously assumed. Given this reality, I argue that the Buddhist tradition as a whole should reevaluate how it views animals. The logic behind the separation of human and non-human animals, after all, rests on the idea that humans are significantly more intelligent than other animals. If that's not the case, and we are now, learning that it is not, then by its own logic, the Buddhist argument for the superiority of humankind collapses. So my argument here is that Buddhist traditions should reevaluate its position on animals. Rather than regarding all animals as inherently stupid and of little moral worth, the tradition should acknowledge the reality of animal emotions and intelligence and should elevate animals closer to the position currently enjoyed by humans. I say closer because I do not want to suggest that Buddhists should entirely collapse the distinction between humans and animals. In addition to suggesting that animals are more intelligent than we had assumed, the scientific literature on this topic also makes really clear that animals' mental lives are varied and complex. Some species speak to each other, other species apparently do not. Some have complex emotional lives, others seem not to. So I do not want to suggest that the correct response to our new awareness of the complexity of animal, mental, and emotional lives is for Buddhists to grant every non-human animal equal status with humans. Instead, we might come to regard some animals as closely akin, See, I put cows and whales. I was going to try to put ravens too, but I couldn't find a raven emoji. So there's no ravens up there. While others are a little bit more distant. That's supposed to be a fruit fly. And some may end up being way past us on some level because octopi are just kind of awesome. My suggestion then is that as a community, Buddhists should draw on the scientific literature about animal cognition to make informed decisions about particular species or even about particular individual animals in particular contexts. This is a complex issue that deserves a complex response. On this point, I'm reminded about a good friend of mine who did genetic research using fruit flies. And he was very distressed to hear from a Tibetan Khenpo that the karma of killing depended on the number of beings killed, not the size of the animal. So killing a fruit fly, he was told, was the same as killing a yak. Now, he had been in this career for a long time, and fruit flies are very small. And yet my friend estimated that if measured by body mass, he had probably killed about 3 yaks worth of fruit flies in his career, which is a lot of flies. So my suggestion here is that we should not necessarily assume equivalency between one fruit fly and one yak. Instead, moral calculations like these should be informed by as much information as we have about the specific animals involved, including questions about sentience, emotional lives, family connections, and so on. Doing this work is likely to be an onerous process and will no doubt involve making mistakes, but it seems to me to be the necessary work for relating to animals in as honest and humble as possible. Before moving on, I want to note that there is some precedence in the Buddhist tradition for viewing animals as relatively intelligent and emotionally aware. As I discussed previously, the tradition as a whole tends to present animals as stupid and incapable of thinking through their situations. There are some instances, however, where that line gets crossed and animals are presented as intelligent and capable. Among the most striking of these passages is an extended reflection found in the autobiography of Jigme Limpa. In this passage, Jigme Limpa is critiquing the slaughter of animals for their meat and uses the animal's experience of the slaughter process as a vivid argument against slaughter. Having now become animals, your fathers, mothers, siblings, and friends from previous lives tremble with fear in the butcher's sinful hands, tears streaming from their eyes and panting for breath. In that state, they wonder what to do. Alas, there is no refuge, there is nowhere to go. Thinking that right now in this place, they may be killed, their urgent suffering is great. In such a state, like one approaching a terrifying pit of hellfire, their body is turned upside down, the muzzle is tied up, and their eyes move wildly with lights shining forth. What they see is their stomach being opened up. With their feet perpendicular, they are set on the path to the next life without even a quiver. I just realized I had 2 slightly different translations of that passage, the one I was reading and the one in the PowerPoint. Apologies for that. Among other things, though, this passage makes clear that Jigme Limpa understands animals to be highly self-aware. The yak he describes knows exactly what is happening to it even before the knife touches it. Jigme Limpa does not explain how it knows it is going to be slaughtered, but something about the situation has caused it to fear its imminent death. Further, the animal is self-aware enough to be afraid of dying. The animal wonders what to do, suggesting that it is seeking for a way to preserve its life. And the language Jigme Limpa uses makes clear that this is not simply some kind of mindless instinctual response. The animal experiences fear, it wonders, and it thinks. All of these terms suggest that this animal is mentally processing and reflecting on what is happening to it, rather than simply responding out of mindless instinct. Another similar passage comes from Patrul Rinpoche's famous Words, My Perfect Teacher. Here, Patrul asks readers to think of an individual animal such as a sheep or a yak that is about to be slaughtered. As it is taken from the flock, it experiences inconceivable terror. Like Jigme Limpa, Patrul's passage assumes that animals are capable of emotional responses like fear. But what really makes this passage fascinating for me is what comes next, where Patrul describes a human prisoner awaiting execution using really similar scenario to the language he just used to describe an animal awaiting slaughter. Once again, Patrul asks his readers to place themselves in the prisoner's position, then reflects, there is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. There is no refuge, no protector. What anguish. In Patrul's presentation, the situation of the prisoner awaiting execution seems to closely parallel the suffering experienced by animals awaiting slaughter. Both panic and look for an escape, a refuge. When none is found, both the prisoner and the animal experience deep fear at the realization that they will soon die. To my reading, this is a striking parallel, suggesting at least the possibility that animals and humans relate to captivity in similar ways. Finally, I am aware of very few passages that suggest that the hard line between animals and religion may not be so hard after all. My favorite of these is found in Raya Shesenge's biography of Ralo Tsawa, an eccentric 11th century Tibetan teacher. These texts describes numerous miracles that Ralo Tsawa performed, including one in which he does teach animals to practice religion. Ralo Tsawa, the text says, taught many dogs and mice to meditate, and did the same for those sheep that belonged to local landowners. He taught about 600 young male and female sheep to meditate. Then a scholar named Geshe Yonten Drakpa came forth to debate this point with him. The scholar said, meditation requires a body with the freedoms and riches, i.e. a human body. Animals lack this freedom, therefore it is impossible to teach them to meditate. Your claims are false. The great teacher Ralo Tsawa replied, generally you are correct. Nevertheless, in some particular cases, it's not certain. In this story, we may note that Ralo Tsawa's claim is met by skepticism on the part of a scholar, who, representing the normative tradition, points out that animals are incapable of religious practice. Ralo Tsawa admits that the scholar is right, but only to a point. In some cases, animals can be taught. The passage thus suggests that animals are, or confirms that animals are generally incapable of meditating or otherwise practicing religion. At the same time, however, it also suggests that this might not be the animal's fault. The animals in question were presumably normal animals, and yet Ralo Tsawa was able to teach them. The key factor then is not the animal's own capacity, but the presence of a sufficiently skilled teacher. I do not want to suggest that passages like these represent the norms of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, or the Buddhist tradition more broadly. As discussed previously, most Buddhists have assumed that animals are stupid and emotionally stunted. These three passages, therefore, are more of an exception than a rule. But I do think that they suggest that my argument today, that the Buddhist tradition should move towards seeing animals as intellectually and emotionally complex beings, somewhat similar to humans, is not actually a radical suggestion. There is, I think, some precedence for seeing animals this way within the tradition itself. The practical results of such a rethinking of the human-animal divide along these lines could be pretty momentous. By elevating the status of non-human animals, Buddhist communities would have to rethink how they relate to those animals, both on theoretical and practical levels. New ethical models would need to be built that reflect how animals actually exist in the world, rather than reflecting outdated assumptions. The Buddhist tradition already includes plenty of practices and ideals that involve kindness towards animals, and certainly the tradition does not, I think, ever suggest inflicting wanton harm on them. But I would suggest that as our perception of animals shifts, practices like loving kindness and compassion might need to be practiced more expansively than they have been. As it is, many Buddhist traditions already include practicing loving kindness and compassion for animals, but they often approach these practices through lenses that see animals as benighted beings deserving of pity. Instead, we may need to adapt these practices to the idea that animals are intellectually and emotionally complex participants in samsara, not just its victims. We may also need to collectively pay more attention to practices that harm animals. If one of the main goals of Buddhism is to reduce suffering in the world, and if animals suffer more acutely than we had previously assumed, then perhaps we need to elevate the attention we pay to our role in things like industrial animal production. Industrial animal agriculture was built and morally justified on Cartesian assumptions that animals were mere machines, somewhat akin to plants. Rather than individual beings with wants and fears, industrial agriculture sees these animals as units to be produced, by which is usually meant born, raised, and slaughtered. As we learn more about the mental lives and suffering experienced by the pigs, cows, and chickens involved, we may need to reconsider our own participation in these systems, and perhaps increase the proportion of our own time and energy that we put into trying to dismantle them. Even practices that currently view animals in a relatively positive light might need to shift. Life ransoming practices, tsetar in Tibetan, in which captive animals are purchased and released, might need to be considered in the light of their complex impact on ecosystems. It's not hard to imagine a situation where releasing a relatively unintelligent animal with relatively little moral standing could be hugely disruptive to the lives of more intellectually or emotionally complex animals, so that the attempt to relieve the suffering of a few animals results in much greater suffering for others. This is already a complex moral calculation that will only become more complex once the differences in intellectual and emotional and spiritual capabilities between different animals are added to the mix. And yet, once again, this seems to me to be necessary work if we are going to live lives focused on reducing suffering. At this point, I feel like I've been beating around the proverbial nail for a bit too long, taking what is actually a pretty simple argument and turning it into something complicated. So let me wrap up with a quick summary. My claim here is simply that, first, given what we are learning about the realities of animal, intellectual, and emotional lives, the Buddhist tradition needs to reconsider its assumptions about the difference between human and non-human animals, accepting that many animals have mental lives akin to our own. Two, if we accept this, the Buddhist tradition's own logic demands that we shift the moral calculations surrounding animals, taking their wants and needs more seriously. This, in turn, would produce in our practical treatment of non-human animals. And that's the end for me today. Thank you all for coming, and I'll turn it back to Karen, and we'll move over to questions.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. And maybe if you stop, there we go. Stop sharing the screen, and then you can we'll pin you. Add spotlight, that's what I mean to do. Okay, now I remove spotlight for myself to look if you can get us both spotlight. That's good. So thank you so much, Jeff. That was really interesting. And I have a bunch of questions, but then I saw that there's some really good questions in the question app. And I'll just remind everyone to look in the chat for the link to the question app. And my questions really overlapped, some of them anyways, overlapped with one here that it was a two-part question that Philip Murphy asked. And so Philip, if you'd like to ask that two-part question yourself. And then there's also Jonathan asked a question. And then I also see Lu Huang there has a question as well. So that's the order that we'll go in. So Philip, are you?
Hello.
There. Oh, there you are. Okay, great.
Hello.
Philip.
Jeffrey, thanks so much. That was a great presentation. Appreciate it. Yeah, my question in two parts was essentially related to using the mental emotional lives of human beings as a standard measure of moral worth and the potential for anthropocentric framing in that.
I mean, I'm going to say, yeah, absolutely. That's what's happening here, right? And I mean, I think I'm doing that less out of a calculated belief that that is the baseline than a practical, this is what we know kind of thing. And it's what historically we've used for, I mean, a long time as the baseline. I'm totally would be happy to enter into discussions about what other baselines might look like, right? And how we might do that. But part of what I think I'm trying to do is to sort of push a little bit on what are actually some pretty established kind of philosophical ideas out there in the world. And a lot of those do come from this kind of a position where human experience is the baseline, right? Honestly, if I could get into anybody's head, I would love to be I would love to have the experience of an octopus.
I'm not surprised to hear you say that.
Yeah, with these distributed nervous systems and like, yeah, I would love that. But I have no idea. And I have no idea how an octopus experiences the world. And so I have a difficulty coming up with a set of moral practices taking an octopus as a baseline, right? As sort of admirable as that would be, I don't, yeah, I find it to have, like, it would be a practical difficulty for me because I just can't, I don't have that experience. I don't have that ability to kind of wrap my head around how an octopus lives. But I bet it's pretty neat.
So on a related note, so the thought being that rather than having a comparator to determine moral standing, more about as much as one can objectively determine, and again, it's a line that's going to move as we learn more, but beings that are sentient, and I'm thinking about the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness from 2012 as being at least a starting point. Certainly, you know, the animals that we use for food, for example, are above that line. But I just interested in your thoughts. That seems to me a more kind of functional rather than comparator.
Yeah, I mean, I think my concern, or I mean, I'll start by saying yes. If we can make that work, awesome, right? It's more sort of, my issue is more practical, and like, how do we measure this without using our own experience as a baseline? You know, do we have some kind of wires that we can read the brain of a cow and understand how it feels without using ourselves as a exemplar? There's also, and I'm gonna, as I'm thinking about this, there's also a piece of me that feels like, to some level, it's okay to use my own experiences as a baseline, as long as I'm doing that, with the awareness that it is that's what I'm doing. And I think about, for example, I don't know how you all were taught, but like when I was a kid, I was taught that you never anthropomorphize animals in a story. If you're like writing a story, right? You're not supposed to do that, right? Animals and humans different, right? But that feels very artificial at this point. And, if we start with this assumption that humans and animals are both animals, right? That we're actually way more similar than we are different, then it does feel like maybe some animals, like cows, are actually pretty similar to us, right? Why would I assume that they don't have an emotional response? Like, a mother cow, why would I imagine that a mother cow would have an emotional response super different than mine, given that we're both animals with relatively similar biology, right? An octopus is another kind of deal, right? But, cows and humans, I don't know, we're like 99% the same. So I would, I feel like, there's part of me that wants to say, like, actually, you know what, I kind of want to, almost like as a corrective against all of these years of being told to not think like that, right? Not think of non-human animals using human style emotions, if that kind of makes sense. So yeah, I mean, I want to kind of have my cake and eat it too here and be like, yes, you're right. This is anthropocentric, and I get that, and I get that there's problems with that. But I also think there's a value to sort of, I don't even know if I want to say it's like the inverse of anthropocentrism, where trying to like see human emotions not as the baseline, but as an example of a normative mammal, mammalian response and to something. And maybe I don't know if this is making sense at this point, but yeah.
No, thank you.
It's a good question.
Briefly, I have a bunch of dogs that might be acting up, and I want to hear what Jonathan has to say. I'm a big fan of his work. But I guess just briefly, I'll say that you mentioned kind of like pragmatic boots on the ground to be applied ethics. So clearly, without instrumentation, we know from watching the behavior, behaviorally indicative, that animals, have a coherent moral, inner life, and they pleasure and avoid pain and that kind of thing. So in terms of pragmatic, I think just really being more consciously, and I'm as an activist in animal justice activist in Buddhist communities, to be like, well, clearly we know these animals are above that line, and behave accordingly. And I'll leave it there because I do want to hear what Jonathan has to say. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question.
Yeah, so I've just asked Jonathan to, hopefully he'll come on, voice, if not audio, I mean, audio, if not video. But meanwhile, maybe I'll just ask a follow-up to, because that conversation touched on two of my, and maybe I'll pin myself while I'm, whoops, sorry about this. And so my questions, yeah, so I had two that were related to the conversation. And one thing is sometimes when I've talked about animals in Buddhism, and just to give a rough characterization, people have said, well, what about, or just the larger, more than human world, people have said, well, what about the Jataka Tales? And my response is, well, the Jataka Tales, they're really like very much human beings and not animals. They don't really act like animals. I don't know. But I don't really know the Jataka Tales that well. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that. And then my other related question was when, you did have those Tibetan authors thinking about the inner emotional life of animals, it was about their suffering. Like there's not, and okay, there's Buddhist reasons for that, I understand. But, not when I think that I have a different sort of with my experience with animals, like I don't think necessarily if there's,
Yeah.
there's a whole range of emotions, and so I'm curious what your thoughts about that, both in terms of literature and also in this more constructive philosophical project.
I mean, so honestly, that actually, my thoughts on that dovetail a lot with some of like my thoughts on the Jatakas, actually, which is that context, to my reading of a lot of these materials, context is huge. Because what I don't think we have anywhere is a Buddhist author sitting down and saying, let me tell you how I think animals think, right? Like, I don't know of any Buddhist author that's going to sit down and make a whole treatise or a section of a treatise that's really just focused on that kind of analysis. Instead, this comes up in other places, right? So both Jigme Limpa and Patrul are trying to, these passages come from sections where they're trying to persuade people to stop eating meat, right? Or at least stop slaughtering in a certain way. And so they've got an agenda, and they're writing in a way that describes the suffering of the animal, right? They're not trying to present a comprehensive account of animal emotion here. They're just trying to say, if you do this one thing, it's going to hurt them, so don't do it, right? And they experience that. And I think they're trying to write with punch, right? My sense with with some of these texts is that they're really, they're trying to create this affective response in the reader, where you cry or you have this emotional sort of oh crap, right? So I think that there's agenda behind these. I also honestly think something similar about a lot of these stories or a lot of these passages that really strongly emphasize the difference between humans and animals, because a lot of these come from contexts where what the author is saying is, you need to take your human life, this precious human life, and use it well, right? Because it's such a rare thing to have. So again, they're not actually writing about animals. They're not trying to give this sort of neutral, just the facts, or here's what I think about animals. They're setting up the animal as a foil, right? The horribleness of an animal life as a foil to make human life look better and more valuable and get people to want to use it more. So I think we have to read all of these kinds of stories with, trying to read them within their context. And so, yeah, I mean, I would love to sit there and sit down with Jigme Limpa and be like, what do you think that dog's doing when you pet it? What's going through its head? Does it have, how is it responding, right? And, my guess is that would say something like, hey, it's happy, right? It enjoys this. It's having a pleasure sensation, right? Kind of like when, you scratch your head, it feels good. But he didn't write that. At least maybe he did, but I don't remember exactly where it is, or haven't seen it or whatever. Does that kind of address your questions, Karen?
Yeah, thank you. And go
I
ahead.
just want to jump in on the Jatakas again and just say that, yeah, they're fascinating, but I think we have to be really careful about reading them as any kind of quote unquote realistic depiction of actual real world animals, as opposed to animals used for educational purposes, kind of thing. Anyway.
Thank you. And so Jonathan, if you are here, because you had asked the first question in the Slido chat, but I'm having trouble getting, there we go. Okay, good.
Thank you. And thank you for the wonderful talk. So my question is really not so much about anthropocentrism. I don't think that's as much the issue. I think I'm a little bit more interested in how once say we can, I think, generally understand panindically sentience as this kind of like baseline entrance into a moral community, right? But then you have, I'd say explicitly said in the Jain tradition, in which they're saying that actually moral standing is going to be scaled according to sense faculties, right? And this becomes a harder question, I think, among, say, animal people in the West, because like you said earlier, it's kind of how are we going to do a seesaw with the fruit fly and the whale or the chicken and the pig, which is why years ago, right, PETA used to say, if you're going to eat an animal, eat a blue whale. But others responded, it was a little tongue in cheek, but others responded with this notion that, you know, blue whales we know are highly intelligent, right? And this becomes an issue. So this is really more of the heart of my question is, I do think we have to engage with the idea that when we talk about moral standing, it's going to have to exist on a scale. The question is, what are the factors that determine that scale? And I would, and the reason it's concerning is that it seems like specifically, say, in the disability community, when we start talking about intelligence, or as you said earlier, even more idiosyncratic, the ability to perform religious rituals or meditation. How do you think is a good way to say engage with Buddhist communities, but maybe not by reproducing certain forms of, say, obscure discrimination?
Yeah. You know, again, I don't know what the best scales are here, right? Like I don't have a hard sense of what the right sort of way to weigh things are, right? The part of the reason that I'm focused on intelligence in this is because that's the thing that the Buddhist tradition has traditionally said humans have and animals don't, right? Or this combination of intelligence and emotional capability, and then ultimately between those, this sort of spiritual thing, ability. And so part of, I think where I'm coming from on this is less about trying to establish that as the correct thing than trying to say, look, according to the own interior logic of the tradition, right? If we take its claims, you know, these sort of broad collection of claims seriously, right, then we have to include animals higher up on this spectrum than we have, right? And so there's still room, and I would welcome, you know, these conversations about like, okay, well, that spectrum that I've laid out as that I'm reading in the Buddhist tradition is itself problematic, right? Okay, yeah. But part of, I think, at least what I'm trying to do is sort of point to that, the internal logic that's already present within the tradition. In part, in order to say, look, moving in this direction doesn't require getting rid of important parts of the tradition, or doesn't require like radically revising things. It just requires shifting how we think and some of the assumptions that we make. So Jonathan, I don't know if that's addressing your question. It doesn't really get into the how do I do this without encouraging you know, subtle types of discrimination. And
I guess we could sidestep that tricky part, and I think more so, I think what's interesting, and I'm curious about it myself, is that on the one hand, there's the move to say that given what we know now about cognition and intelligence, we need to change preconceived notions within the tradition itself, which were incorrect, right? Incorrect. But there's also other truths that might also reveal inaccuracies, such as, right, the idea that the assumption that, for example, humans in confinement suffer a lot more than animals in confinement. But if we take the idea that actually human beings who might know why they're there, how long they're going to be there, the reasons that they're there, might have coping mechanisms that actually alleviate their suffering much more than, say, monkeys in a laboratory who have no idea and think they're going to be there every day. And so you can, or even other animals. So we could say that in some ways, intelligence actually does not correlate with suffering in the way that we assume.
Yeah. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And part of why I think when I wrote the talk, I keep coming back to this sort of triumvirate of like intelligence and emotion and spiritual ability as sort of markers, is because I'm trying to flag some of the complexity that would come up with a situation like that. Yeah, so I don't know if I have too much more of a response to that other than, yeah, I mean, I agree, right? And to the degree that we're actually sitting down and trying to say, okay, like, where is a particular situation on this continuum, right? Which, as I was making this slideshow for today, I was kind of laughing at myself and like, okay, I've got like a bipolar, I've got a line, right? And this is a joke, but it's a visual, right? And and so as I was, as we're talking about this, I would totally agree with including as many factors as we can and figuring out how and where in this weird 4-dimensional space that we're going to try to make an actual real life decision about a question. In some way, I always feel like, I keep coming back to okay, well, what happens in real life, right, when we try to implement this? And, as we try to make those distinctions, yeah, the more we can work into that, the better. And I would have no qualms with saying, actually, yeah, the monkey in confinement is having a worse time than a human in confinement who knows why they're there.
Great. Thank you so much, and for all your work.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. There's some great questions. So I'm just going to, the order is Lou will ask the question next, and then Malaya, and then Julia. And then there's also some additional questions in the chat.
Yeah. Thank you for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm just thinking how Buddhists can account for the karmic theory, because there is a continuation between past life and this life, and the separation between human and animals only accounts for this life. But in past lives, maybe this is an animal, but many times it is a human. But suddenly, because it takes animal body and we regard it as some kind of dumb, like less intelligent than human. But in past lives, they have been many times being animals. But how can we account for that? Is it just because of like taking up an animal body makes it dumb, or taking up a human body makes it intelligence? I think this is a paradox that we have to solve if we want to commit to the karmic theory. And there is certainly a hierarchy here, like the simplistic assumption that humans are more higher in this cycle and more capable of like meditation practice. But there are some stories like a parrot or a bird can chant and can get rebirth.
Yeah.
But yeah, as you have said, this might be agenda, like the writer want to convert someone to chant Buddha's name, so that the writer just wrote that the parrot can chant. But I think, and some animals like cows, there are some stories that like cows can remember their past lives, and kind of because of what kind of bad karma, they become a cow, and then this life it is a cow. It kind of sad and want to do hard work to repay its bad karma and want to be reborn into a human. So I'm just thinking, how does this cyclic existence and this karmic theory can contribute to this great enterprise of want to make the demarcation between human and animal less salient than before. Like,
I guess, I mean, I think on my reading of karma theory, I don't think that there's a conflict here, right? I think that we can, you know, or that somebody could simultaneously accept that, okay, in this particular life, that being has been reborn as a cow, you know, who knows why, but they have been. While also thinking, okay, well, you know, that cow has a rich life, a rich inner life of its own, that is worth defending and protecting, right? So I don't, you know, I feel like there's not a conflict here, I guess, is sort of my...
Exactly. I also think that like human even create more crimes, more bad karma than animals. That animals sometimes live a more meaningful and more simple life than humans. And animal life should be as justified as human life. But in Buddhist theory, there is a hierarchical karmic theory there, and think that it is because of bad karma, it is because reborn into an animal. Like, how can we converse, like talk to these Buddhists who like have like ingrained understanding of this karmic theory?
I mean, I think you know, there's a couple of questions here. I mean, I feel like the how do we talk to them is, I don't have an answer other than skillfully, right? And, you know, but I think that, yeah, I mean, again, I don't feel like there's any, to me, these two actually go together quite well, right? Yeah, it's interesting. I think that this, your question sort of brought to my mind is something I had at one point when I was thinking about this paper, just wanted to include, and then when I was actually writing it, forgot about. And that's that if you go back to the Bhava Chakra, the wheel of life, one of the features that you often see is a little tiny Buddha in each of the 6 realms teaching, right? And he's in there with the animals too, which seems to suggest, again, like a good teacher, the Buddha, is capable of teaching animals in an effective and skillful way. So again, all of this is to just sort of, you know, we can approach it as a hierarchy, or we can approach it as like a constellation. You know, I think, you know, one of the ways we might talk to somebody who's really committed to the hierarchy is to just, you know, start thinking of it as less linear. And again, you know, I realize I think I'm part of the problem here, right? With that slide I had of the one simple line, right? You know, it's there because I'm trying to make a point. But there are plenty of ways in which some animals are probably way past us in certain ways. And so it's, you know, you can say, look, maybe this isn't quite such a linear system as, or quite such a hierarchical system as the tradition has maintained, but rather one of complexity. And yeah,
and I also think that Buddhism also have a spectrum, like that, like a diversity there, because like Buddhism also have this Buddha nature theory, like every animal, every human have their Buddha nature, and it can be because of this Buddha nature, they are actually the same. They also have this kind of theory, and also in how to generating the Buddha Citta, the enlightenment mind, there is also a teaching that to treat every animal, every human as your mother, because once they have been your mother. So because of this theory, it seems that based on this theory, this is less hierarchical than this wheel is showing us. So there is also a spectrum there.
No, I think,
and I'm thinking, who is?
Yeah, and I think I'll maybe just sort of reiterate also, I think so many of the times where the arc, I think with these, when they're talking about the wheel, the Bhava Chakra and these things, so many of the instances where that rigid hierarchy is presented, I really think a lot of it is about the rhetoric of telling people, you have this really rare life right now, you need to use it, rather than trying to make a, like, I don't know, like a sort of like, it's like the point is not necessarily the hierarchy, but the result on the sense in the listener that they need to use their precious human life, right? Anyway, yeah, anyway, there's just a few of my thoughts, but I appreciate the question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, Malaya's next. And I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Yes, my name is Malaya. Thank you for giving this presentation. It's very interesting.
No, thank you.
So I wanted to say that the complex social relationships that animals navigate
Mhm,
shows their intelligence,
mhm,
their ability to make decisions and plan.
mhm,
So like, for example, research by Susan Haig, who is a biologist in Corvallis, Oregon,
mhm,
on bluebirds, has shown that asexual, aromantic male bluebirds help rear the babies of their brothers and sisters,
mhm.
and also the symbolism in animal cultures also, and abstract symbolism also points to their complex intelligence. But I feel like there are a lot of problems of using intelligence as a barometer. So I mean, it's very problematic. One of the reasons why I think it's problematic is that our understanding of animals' intelligence is limited by our own understanding of them and our own ignorance. And then also, so other species of animals are different, like in terms of their sensory systems, their organs, and these types of things, and their life experiences. And so their inner world is different. And an example of that can also be seen in some humans. So like people on the autism spectrum have a very different inner experience and inner world than neurotypical people.
Right.
And so I'm wondering like and of course as we learn more about the biology of other species, then we understand more about the ways in which they're intelligent and the ways that they make decisions and about their cultures. But it almost feels like what we're doing with non-human animals is that we are it's like we're trying to decide whether or not to give them rights when like we're just kind of like, instead I feel like we should just be recognizing their personhood. So
Mhm.
like I don't know if that's making sense, like with
Right.
like women, there was a time when a lot of scientists thought that women were less intelligent than men,
Mhm.
and even incapable of having an orgasm too, because they didn't know what the clitoris was for. And so like these are just some examples, or less of a person than a man. And so why, and there are different forms of intelligence as well,
Mhm.
like emotional intelligence, and some forms of intelligence maybe that we don't even know about. So why is the emphasis on intelligence rather than suffering? Because what we have in common with these different species of animals is that we all suffer. And also insects are very different from humans in many ways, but they feel pain exquisitely.
Yeah, so start again. Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I as I go through this and go back into this work, I'm clearly going to be re-interrogating what I mean, or what the tradition means when it talks about intelligence here. But the main reason that I harp on it is simply that that's what I read the tradition harping on. And so I don't mean to isolate intelligence as a particular type of intelligence either. I mean, I think the presentation, kind of by necessity, the talk today is very oversimplified, right? I've got a little cartoon human, right, representing all of humanity. And clearly there's a lot of distinction there to be made, right? And there's also a lot of distinction to be made in non-human animality, right? And I don't want to suggest that there's not. I don't want to be dismissive of that or something else. So I guess I didn't mean to be suggesting that those kinds of distinctions are unimportant. And in all honesty, those are exactly the kind of distinctions I'm trying to nudge the Buddhist side of things towards, right? Is recognizing the complexity of these interactions and recognizing the complexity of animal lives. And, I put the octopus over on the other side of the person on there as, a little bit of a joke, but it's also not, right? Because why not have an octopus beyond a human on the moral standing scale, right? Like, I'm not opposed to that, right? So again, when I use the word intelligence, I don't mean it in a specific kind of way, right? I'm trying to use it in as broad a way as possible, if that makes sense. And I would absolutely agree with as much complexity as we can bring to this, and as much sympathetic awareness and humility that as we can bring to this question. So I don't know, does that address a little bit of what you're asking?
Well, a little bit. Maybe like, are there is there much like written in the Buddhist tradition about animal suffering?
Yeah, okay, so the question of using suffering as a baseline. Yeah, and in other work that I've done, when I've done more historical stuff, I have, phrased a lot of it in terms of suffering and capacity for suffering, right? And part of why I'm not at this point is that there's a way in which I find, like, I don't want that to be the limiting factor either, right? Like, I'm not sure that we want to end up in a place where suffering is the barometer, rather than joy, or a blend of all of these things. I mean, when I pet my cat, I'm not causing him to suffer, hopefully, but I am bringing him joy. And so there's more, I guess, part of why I'm not singling out suffering as the point of departure is that I don't know that we want to do that. I think we want to allow for a more complex, sort of collection of possibilities. Again, I feel like I'm sort of trying to use shorthand here, and clearly I'm needing to interrogate the language I'm using for that shorthand. And I appreciate the comments on that. But I'm using words like intelligence and emotional life, not in a super technical sense, but more because I need words as a stand-in for what's going on potentially in an animal's head. And so I'm going to think more about how better to express that, and possibly different language to use. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And also, yeah, that is a good point that we do share. We also, as well as sharing suffering with other species of animals, we also all experience like love, joy, these other emotions as well, although they are harder to quantify.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know that I want to quantify suffering either. And that's part of the trouble here is, you know, I'm trying to make this vague argument that we need to take animal experience into account. But that's hard to measure in specifics.
I just wanted to jump in because there's some comments, some questions and comments in the Q&A that are very much related to this conversation you've just been having. I think the points about like thinking about neural diversity in humans, and you know, how can we apply some of our greater, sorry, I don't know how to turn that off. How to apply that in relationship to the broader neural diversity of our with more than human beings. But some of the comments and questions talked about, you know, how do we reconcile human life as being so auspicious or superior when we are the only species that unnecessarily harms and kills other sentient beings? And then also speaking to animal capacities. Oh, sorry, I wish I could turn that off. Do we have evidence that persuades us of animals engaging in bodhisattva-like acts of compassion? And would that inform the discussion of this topic? And so this just goes to the point that you were just discussing about animals experiencing joy and other. Okay, I'll figure out how to I'll turn off my mic now if you had any responses to that. And then Julia had a question. And then there's some questions.
Can I jump in on a couple of these?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll jump on that last one first. Yeah, I think there's absolutely evidence. And I think there's both evidence, and I think that we also just see it all the time about animals engaging in bodhisattva-like activity of sort of selfless behaviors that benefit some other creature in their community. And not necessarily the same species. And I think that the evidence for that is pretty abundant. And I absolutely think, yeah, that informs this discussion. Let's see, the question about how do we reconcile the human superiority thing, I want to come back to this suggestion that I'm not sure we need to. I think, again, on my read, I feel like a lot of the language of human superiority is less meant as like dispassionate scientific analysis and more meant as a motivational speech to get the audience to get off their butts and do something with their human life, something good, right? So I think a lot of the language of human superiority can be read in context along those lines, rather than being like, okay, these are the ancient Buddhists coming up with a dispassionate scientific schema of, you know, the ways in which humans are better than animals. So I'm not, I guess the language of human superiority it's concerning to me on the practical level because, yeah, there's a lot of suffering in the world that happens because people think that humans are superior to animals. And in many ways, the whole point of this project is to try to push back on that assumption a little bit, and at a minimum complicate that discussion and make it not so straightforward. So, you know, on the practical level, yeah, I think that it's a really important point to wrestle with, right, and to push back on. On a sort of literary level, it doesn't concern me as much, I guess. So I tend to read them as rhetoric aimed at amplifying someone's sense of their precious human life and that they've got to do it now. And I think there was another question in there, Karen, that I missed, but I also know Julia's had her hand up for a while.
Yeah, let's go to Julia, and then I'll follow up with, there's one more question from the chat. So Julia, yes, great.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for your talk and for your work on this, what I feel is a neglected aspect of Buddhist theory and practice. My question has to do with practice on the ground. And do you think that as knowledge about sentience and animal sentience in particular expands, do you think we'll see a shift in the use and consumption of meat in Buddhist ritual practices? And I'm thinking specifically of Tantra, but you can speak to that more generally.
Yeah, I bloody well hope so.
Right.
So
Is the shift
pun intended. So yeah, I mean, the question of Tantra is a complicated one. And I also don't want to sit here and tell a bunch of Tibetans what to do, right? Like there's other stuff going on that's outside of my ken, and I want to be aware and respectful of that. But the first thing, and the only thing I'll say is one of the things that I talk about a lot in some of my earlier work, which is more historical, is simply that there's actually a lot of different perspective on the role of meat in Tantra. And there are prominent voices that say you shouldn't have any at all. And that you use substitutes, right? You know, the Dudjwan tradition, when you make, when you do the ritual, you include mendrup, and you make the mendrup, these sort of little pills, by blending all of these ingredients, which are theoretically supposed to include the 5 meats, right? But the 5 meats are hard to actually get, right? And initially also the whole point of the 5 meats in the first place was that you didn't have to kill anything to get them, right? Those animals, the 5 meats, are never slaughtered. So you don't have to go and kill an animal to get the 5 meats, you just find it, right? It's naturally there on the side of the road. But then, since you can't get that stuff in Tibet, what they say instead is what you do is you take a board, a piece of wood, and you carve out the shapes of the 5 animals, right? And then you take some tsampa and you press it into the board. And then you have these little animal cookies. But even that is too close to real meat. So then you take that and you dissolve it in water, or you leave them in water for 24 hours. And then it's that water that you use to make the rest of the mendrup, right? So there's already, within Tibetan discourse, there's already a lot of discussion of this. I translated a short text by the 8th Karmapa, where he uses this really strong didactic, scholastic debate language, right? And it actually, like the reading of the text only makes sense if you understand how debate works. But he's basically saying, oh, so you think you're supposed to use Tantra in it? Well, is it like this or is it like this? You're supposed to use meat in your tsok offering. And oh, so you say it's like this? Well, then this is why you don't do it. And this is why that makes no sense. Oh, it's like that other way? Well, then here's why that is equally absurd. And, you know, so that's, it's just a short little passage, but that's available in The Faults of Meat, which is out from Wisdom. And yeah, so there's already a lot of debate over the appropriateness of meat. And I know I quoted Jigme a couple of other times already tonight, but he, you know, there's this great passage where he says, forget the quote, but it's something along the lines of like, oh, yeah, I suppose if you're a really high level tantric practitioner, yeah, maybe you should eat meat, but I'm not, so I don't, right? Or something along those lines. And, you know, if Jigme Lingpa is telling us he's not at that level, you know, the assumption is going to be, okay, I guess I'm not either, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, so my point here is just to say that, you know, that discussion is ongoing, and I know lots of contemporary lamas who are deeply engaged in these kinds of debates among themselves, and there's a lot of disagreement. Right? Yeah. Here we go.
And a follow-up question.
Someone tossed in a quote from Chantal Rinpoche in there, Philip. Yes. Yeah.
How has your research into these topics and issues in the living traditions today maybe changed your own like animal and meat consumption?
I was vegetarian before I started.
Okay.
It's part of why I started this research. Yeah, Philip posted a quote from Chantal Rinpoche. I took vegetarian vows from Chantal Rinpoche many years ago. And so I started to, you know, with that. Yeah, I mean, the story of how I got into all this was simply that, you know, I was reading The Words of My Perfect Teacher, and I came across some of those passages, and I was just sort of like, wait a minute, I thought all Tibetans ate meat. And started to push a little bit, and all of a sudden it's like, actually they don't, right? And there is a tradition of vegetarianism in Tibet, and not all the lamas ate meat at any point in Tibetan history. and you know, not all of them were vegetarian either. But this debate was out there already and was already happening, but no one was talking about it. So that was really where this whole thing started. You know, how has it affected my own practice? I don't know. It's kind of, I feel like I kind of built my life around it at this point. I definitely think of myself as an activist, but that manifests in different ways, and yeah, different times. So if there's anything I can ever do to help anyone who's here with that, feel free to reach out. Right, I'm always happy to talk to people, to share stuff, to share texts, and to do what I can to have a voice.
Great. I think that question of integration is really important. So thank you for those reflections. And I'm sure you have a million more questions to answer.
At least one or two.
Yeah, well, that was actually the question from the chat, which I was, you know, how given your research, what impactful changes have you integrated into your life? Would you like to see more activism or veganism? So that was
yeah.
That was the question I was going to conclude with, because we're at 6:30, and I thought that was a nice way. If you want to add anything to that.
No, I think I'll just say again how much of a pleasure it's been, and I really appreciate the discussion we've had afterwards. I mean, this is kind of the first time I've been, you know, presented on this at AAR last year, but that was a much smaller, you know, sort of a much smaller group, and so it's really, I'm happy to be getting this out and to be getting the feedback, and really appreciate being invited.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, it was because I attended your AAR presentation where the American Academy of Religion, for people in the room who are not scholars or not scholars of religion. And I think it's such an interesting thing, like in light as our knowledge grows, you know, how does this change the way that we understand, you know, kind of classical Buddhist doctrines? What are constructive ways that we can apply them to our situation that we're in now? And so our situation you already mentioned of industrial farming, but also of our climate and ecological crisis. So I feel like I'm really excited to see people who do textual work also thinking through the constructive implications of their work, as being sort of more on the philosophy side myself. So I so appreciated your speaking with us this evening, and thank you to everyone who came. And we have been recording, so we'll be able to share that link with you. And do join us next in 2 weeks for Annabella Pitkin's talk on yogic power in light of discourses of modernity and secularity in Tibetan Buddhism. And have a nice evening, everyone. And thank you again, Jeff.